Hi everyone, welcome back to the next part of our third lecture. So this week this will be a fairly long lecture because there is a lot of material to work through in terms of introducing all of the aspects in the feature system that we'll be using. This is really important going forward in this course that you have an idea of how to use these features because you're going to be constantly confronted with them in every lecture and every exercise, every homework assignment. You don't need to, since you can constantly refer to the charts in Hayes' textbook, you don't need to systematically memorize all of the details of these phonological features, but understanding generally what they mean will help you a great deal. Okay, so the remainder of this lecture, my objective is to describe the Hayesian feature system in detail and to explain how particular features serve to group together particular sounds. So we'll begin with the manner features. And for manner features, the kind of grounding for the manner features that will be used is the concept of sonority. And that is going to form the basis for creating a set of features that can generate well-established manners of articulation. Unfortunately, it's difficult to give a very precise definition of what the sonority of a segment means, but we might say it's approximately something like the amount of acoustic energy that a sound has, as well as the degree of openness in the vocal tract. So at extremes, in terms of sonority, you can talk about voiceless stops as opposed to vowels. Vowels are very open. If you look at a spectrogram, there's a great deal of acoustic energy there to be seen. Whereas with a voiceless stop, there's no vibration happening, no airflow happening at that moment until after the stop closure is released. And among phonologists, there exists the notion of a sonority scale, which arranges constants of different manners plus vowels from most sonorous to least sonorous. And this arrangement that I give in example 8 is more or less agreed upon. A lot of persons would also further make a division based on voicing, seeing voiceless sounds as less sonorant than voiceless sounds, but we can move along manners from stops, affricates, fricatives, nasals, liquids, glides, all the way to vowels to go from least sonorous sounds to progressively more sonorous sounds. So the major natural classes of manner of articulation can then be characterized with respect to various cutoff points, various divisions in this sonority continuum. So begin here, and I'll occasionally move between the feature chart. If we begin with the features syllabic, approximant, and sonorant, those serve to divide up most of the manners of articulation. So here we have sonorant and approximant in Hayes charts, and syllabic. Remember, I already mentioned syllabic as a vowel to distinguish, as a feature to distinguish vowels from all other sounds. So the feature syllabic will contrast vowels with all other sounds that would traditionally be called consonants, the glides, liquids, nasals, fricatives, affricates, and stops. The feature sonorant, if we come down here, is going to be used for making the traditional division between so-called sonorants and so-called obstruents. Typically, one typical correspondence between non-sonorant and sonorant sounds is that in many languages, all sonorant sounds, that is the nasals, liquids, glides, and vowels, are specified as being voiced underlyingly, whereas obstruents may have contrastive voicing. So that's a typical distinction to find in a lot of languages between sonorants and non-sonorants. So you can see this division, plus sonorant versus minus sonorants, divides up the sonorants and the obstruents. And sometimes we'll use these two terms to group together these sets of manners of articulation. And finally, the feature approximant can be used to, the feature approximant essentially refers to whether there is very much of any sort of closure, of oral closure altogether. So in the case of both stops and affricates, as well as nasals, there is some very complete oral closure. What makes nasals a lot more sonorous is the fact that there is then no longer closure in the nasal pathway. The velar port is open and air is able to flow through the nasal pathways. And fricatives usually have a very tight closure. There's only a little bit of air that can escape between the active and passive articulator in that case. So plus approximant then will group together the vowels, glides, and liquids. So vowels like a and e, glides like ya and wa, liquids like la and ra. Whereas the nasals together with the obstruents will build the class of non-approximant sounds. And since we will very often be encountering phonological rules that refer to stops, I want to make you familiar with here this feature delayed release. This feature delayed release is only relevant for minus sonorant sounds. So only stops, fricatives, and affricates are specified for delayed release. What the name of this feature is supposed to mean is that the closure, the sort of point of closure that is created between the active and passive articulator is released immediately by a stop. So you transition in a stop immediately from a closed state to an open state. That means there is no delay in terms of the release. But in the case of affricates and fricatives, it's possible to sustain that closure. So consider a sibilant fricative like s. There is, for that reason, Hayes uses the label of plus delayed release. And if we look over onto the chart, we see then, if we look at the labial place of articulation, the labial nasal, which is a sonorant, has a 0 value for the feature delayed release. And another sonorant, like the lateral alveolar liquid la, is also given a 0 value for the feature delayed release. So if we now consider all of these groups, let's think about how many total natural classes there are for a minute. So let's find the possible natural classes. So we've already named one of them. So there's the natural class of plus syllabic sounds, which are the vowels, and the natural class of the minus syllabic sounds, which are all of the other consonants. So stops, affricates, fricatives, nasals, liquids, and glides. Then we have a natural class of non-consonantal sounds. So this, for a number of you, this may be slightly confusing. Here, the feature consonantal is used to mean, in general, that there is really any sort of closure or blockage of the airflow whatsoever. So in the production of a vowel and a glide, there's really no oral blockage for the passage of air outward. So for that reason, vowels and glides are given the feature minus consonantal. So we have this natural class of vowels and glides that are non-consonantal, whereas all of the other consonants will be plus consonantal, so the liquids and all less sonorous manners of articulation. We then mentioned we have the approximant, which include the vowels, glides, and liquids. And the other and sounds which are not approximant, so nasals plus obstruent, Nasals and obstruents give us the non-approximant sounds. And then finally, if we come down to the feature sonorant, then we have the sounds labeled up here as sonorants, the vowels, glides, liquids, and nasals, and the sounds which are non-sonorant, the obstruents, which are the fricatives, affricates, stops. If we go below the sonorant level, now we have an interesting point, an interesting problem. Namely that we have a sort of discontinuancy here, in that the feature plus continuant defines all of the sonorants with the exception of the nasals, because nasals cannot be defined as continuant precisely because they have closure, they have oral closure, whereas fricatives are plus continuant. And this refers to the fact that those fricatives can be sustained, as I illustrated a minute ago, for a sibilant fricative. And finally, as I already mentioned, the feature delayed release is relevant only to the obstruents. So we obtain most of our divisions using these 4 features. And when we try to make some other groupings here, we'll see that as we go down along these lines, from syllabic down to sonorant, then some things entail the others. So all non-syllabic sounds are plus consonantal, and all all non-consonantal sounds are plus approximant. All plus approximant sounds are also plus sonorant. But if you are not good, right? Okay, so let's think about then one interesting other wrinkle here, which is presented by syllabic consonants. So sometimes, of course, consonants can also serve as syllable nuclei. So a nasal like n, or erotic like r, can serve as the nucleus as a syllable. This means it's kind of an imperfect sonority feature because we can assign the feature plus syllabic to some consonant. So here the IPA symbol, the International Phonetic Alphabet symbol, of a little line beneath the consonant indicates that it is syllabic. Vowels, of course, will not be marked with this symbol because they are considered by default to bear the feature plus syllabic. So as I said, we can consider syllabic to be a near sonority feature, but not strictly a sonority feature, because we're still going to place a syllabic nasal in terms of sonority, in terms of its acoustic energy, at the same point on the sonority scale as all other nasals, the non-syllabic nasals. So if we consider what a feature matrix for defining some syllabic liquids would be like, we would need the features that define liquids, so in contrast to all the other manners. So the liquids are plus consonantal and plus approximant. Let's check this. So liquids are plus approximant and plus consonantal. So right in this domain. The glides, on the other hand, are minus consonantal. The nasals, on the other hand, are minus approximant. And a reason why, in general, you won't find glides being indicated as syllabic either is that the usual sorts of glides, 2 of the most common glides, the palatal glide ya and the labiovelar glide wa, those essentially correspond to vowels. So for instance, the glide ya corresponds to the high front vowel e when it becomes syllabic. One thing that's worth noting in passing here is that also almost every language has a sort of limit in terms of degree of sonority permitted for syllable nuclei. So English, for instance, allows any consonant, any sound that has the feature plus sonorant to serve as a syllable nucleus. So in English, nasals and liquids, in addition to vowels or syllabified glides, can be a syllable nuclei. In Czech, a sound has to be at least plus approximate. So nasals cannot be syllable nuclei in Czech, but liquids are allowed to work as syllable nuclei. And there are some very rare languages, for instance, Berber languages in North Africa and some indigenous North American languages of the Pacific Northwest, so British Columbia, Canada, the state of Washington in the United States, where you also find syllabic fricatives, affricates, and even Slavic stops. Let's say something further about the feature sonorant before we take a short break to close up our discussion of manner features. So the feature sonorant is really important. Remember, it makes this very strong division between so-called sonorants and so-called obstruents. The reason why it's so crucial is that the sounds that belong to the class of obstruents, fricatives, affricates, and stops, those are the only ones that involve enough constriction, enough closure in the mouth to build up air pressure. And for this reason, the feature sonorant is often involved in rules of voicing. So as I mentioned above, I think obstruents, because they have an accumulation of air pressure, they are often sensitive to voicing, whether the vocal cords are allowed to vibrate or not, whereas sonorants very often are not sensitive to such processes. So to take an example, in Japanese, at least among the so-called native, the fully native words are so-called Yamato lexical stratum. Words that have more than one voiced obstruent per stem are avoided. So it's allowed in Japanese to have a word like taba or taza, but a word with two voiced obstruents like daba or daza is categorically ruled out. We could formulate this as a constraint sort of saying, don't allow a stem that contains two voiced obstruents. And as a little bit of practice, let's consider a rule that occurs in the language of Zoque, spoken in southern Mexico. And a rule of this type cannot be found in a number of other languages in the world. This is a process of postnasal voicing, which specifies that these obstruents, these voiceless obstruents, the stop and an affricate, become corresponding voiced stops and a voiced affricate immediately following a nasal. And the natural class that captures that captures the segments on the left side of the arrow here are sounds which are non-sonorant and non-continuant. So the affricates and the stops, so non-sonorant and non-continuant. The fricatives, in contrast, are plus continuant, and these become voiced in this context. So here we see this voicing sensitivity of the obstruents. So in effect, the feature minus sonorant is serving to identify this sensitivity to the difference in voicing, whereas languages that have phonemic contrasts between, say, voiceless and voiced nasals, or voiceless and voiced liquids are extremely rare. Okay, let's take a break here, and when we come back, we will discuss the major places of articulation.